Oh boy, we have an extra exciting section for you. This is a section that I absolutely love. I got into programming because of web development. And in this section, we're going to explore how we can use Python in web development. And actually, the way we use Python in web development will also work with mobile development. And this is a really exciting field because, well, as you're aware, there's lots of web applications. There's lots of mobile applications. And using Python, we can actually help build these applications. In this section, I'm going to give you a general overview of web development, what that involves, how websites actually work, how browsers work. We're also going to use Python to build our own server, our own portfolio webpage, where people can view our portfolios and actually submit maybe a request to work with you or send you a message and actually store it in places like a database. So by the end of this section, you're going to have your own portfolio website that is live and in production. It's going to be a very, very fun one. But in order for us to learn how we can use Python, we need to first understand how the web works. So in the next video, let's learn how the web works. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. So how do websites work? Now, I have an entire web development course, so because this is a Python course, we're not going to go super deep into this topic. Instead, we're going to focus on the Python side of things. But I do want to help you understand what we're building and how everything works, because hopefully by the end of this course, you're able to actually change your portfolio, update your portfolio to your own liking, and showcase the projects that we've built throughout the course. So I have a website for you here. We have XKCD, which is just a little funny comic website. If I click refresh here or enter this URL, I'm taken to this website. But how does this actually work? How is my browser, in this case, Google Chrome, able to display this web page for me? I need to be connected to the internet, right? So there's some sort of data that's being transferred for me to be able to see this. So let's explore how this works. And look at that. I created a nice little diagram for you. And in this diagram, I'm going to attempt to just tell you exactly how it works. It's quite simple. We have our browser right here, which can be Google Chrome, it could be Safari, it could be Firefox. It doesn't matter. This browser, we're able to type into it a website or maybe Google for a website and then click on a website. When we click on a website, what happens is that through internet, the browser makes a request all the way to another machine. And this machine, which we call a server, is located anywhere in the world. It doesn't really matter. Because through our internet network, the browser is going to say, hey, this website, who owns that website? Or which machine can serve me the files for that website? And using some complex logic, it's going to find this server, which at the end of the day is just a computer, and we're actually going to show you and deploy our own server. Well, it simply says, hey, give me some data, because without data, I'm not able to display anything on a web page. And the server, well, first of all, they communicate over something called HTTP and HTTPS. Because the browser and the server are two different machines, right? The browser is on my laptop right now. And the machine, which is a server, it can be anywhere in the world, they need to communicate some way. And we need a rule to say, we don't want all these machines talking to each other with no rules in place. For example, we can agree that when we communicate between you and I'm going to speak in English. In the same way, HTTP and HTTPS, which is a secured, encrypted version of communication, allows me to say, hey, can you give me the data? And the server to understand, oh, this website or this browser needs the data that I have. if I go back to this website over here, you see that I'm using HTTPS. And it's saying I want to use the HTTPS protocol, that is the language, to communicate that I want to go to this website. So as soon as I hit enter, it's going to make that request all the way to a server somewhere. And then the server is going to respond with this data. Let's continue with our diagram. So the request has just been made. This server just happens to have 3 files that we need. One is an HTML file, and this file is the text or content of the website. The other one is the CSS file, and this contains all the styling of the website. So that is colors, maybe some fonts, maybe the position of the elements, anything to do with style so it doesn't look like a boring piece of text. And then we have JavaScript. JavaScript is what gives websites behavior. When I log into Facebook or maybe tweet something on Twitter, JavaScript is allowing me to perform those actions. Because with just HTML and CSS, we just have text and some pretty styling. With JavaScript, we're able to take actions. But we don't need to focus on that too much. All we need to know is that the server, because it's a computer, on its files has these 3 files for us. And these 3 files, what happen, get sent to the browser. Because the browser was really, really kind and asked, hey, can you give me data? And the server says, sure, here it is, and sends us these 3 files. And these 3 files, when they get sent back, the browser understands them. And because it understands them, even though to us it may look like gibberish, it's able to display that website for us. But let me ask you a question. Up until now, I haven't really talked about Python. I thought this was a Python course, Andre. Why are you telling me all this stuff that I don't care about? Well, because in here, there's one piece that can actually be written in Python. Can you guess what that is? If you guessed the server, congratulations. You get 5,000 points. You see, the browser is something that, well, it's an application we download on our computer, right? But up until now, the server was kind of a mystery box, a machine, a computer somewhere. But Python programmers can actually write the logic and the rules that servers can act upon. So all this communication of, hey, can you give me data, can be interpreted in Python and then send this data to the browser using Python. And we're going to build our own server over the next couple of videos, but also touch upon these HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files so we can actually display something like a website. Now, I want to finish off this video with one question. Do you think that this server has to be written in Python? What do you think? No, it doesn't, right? The browser doesn't care what this machine is like. All it cares about is these 3 files. And because we're speaking in this HTTPS protocol, the browser says, hey, I don't care what language you speak, I don't care anything, I'm just going to tell you through this HTTPS, just give me the data that I want. And we can do whatever logic we want in here. I can send emails from here if I want. I can send text messages. I can do math operations. I can play a game on this computer if I want. It doesn't really matter. As long as I am able to send these files back to the browser. So we can do that with Python, but we can do that with other languages like Node, like PHP, like Java. So we can write a server in any type of language. The only thing we can't really do is on the browser side. On the browser side, we have to use these 3 files because, well, at least in general terms, it can only understand JavaScript, which is another programming language. All right, let's explore this topic a little bit more in the next video. In the previous video, we learned that a browser simply sends a request to a server somewhere in the world over internet using the HTTPS protocol, and then it receives those JavaScript, HTML, and CSS files so that it's able to display a website. Now, how can we actually check this? Well, I can actually go to View, Developer, and this is using Google Chrome. So I recommend for this part to use Google Chrome so you can follow what I'm doing. If I go to Developer Tools here, it's going to open up a little box here with some information for me. Now, what I want to focus on is this Network tab. And this Network tab is going to tell us what type of information we receive from the server. If I refresh here, you'll notice that I get some data here. Now, you want to make sure that there's no filter involved. So we want to say over here that we want everything. So there's no filter, everything, there's no searching going on. And we can refresh again. And all right, we see a lot more files. But this looks intimidating. Let's think about what we just learned. We learned that we first get an HTML file, which happens to be this one. It says over here, type document. And if I click over here, this is an HTML document. So the response from the server, when I hit refresh, remember, it communicated to a server somewhere in the world that had these files on that computer. And here we have our HTML file. If I'll scroll down, look at that. We can see over here the webcomic of romance, sarcasm, math, and language, which is right over here. Remember how I said HTML is the text that gets displayed on a website? Well, this is our HTML here that the server responded with. And the browser knows how to read this and display the text. What about the CSS? Well, I can actually click on this CSS tab here, and it'll show me all the CSS files that came from the server. And you see over here that this, again, looks a little bit different. It's in a different syntax than an HTML, but all it does here is it gives me the styles that I want. You can see over here, we can pick background color, we can pick different position, width, left, position, and this gives us the styling that we want on a website. And then if we go to JavaScript, we actually see the JavaScript files that this website uses. Now, we don't have to worry about JavaScript here. JavaScript allows us to do some interactivity on this website that, for now, we probably don't need to worry about. Now, I do want to point out that there's a few other things in here, like image and media. And as you can see, images, we definitely have some images in here that we are using. If I click on preview, we can see the images. But at the end of the day, the concept is the same. We have an HTML file, which in our case is right over here. You see how the HTML file is displayed without CSS, which is just the textual data. We have the CSS, which is the styling of our page, and then some JavaScript to make our page interactive, and maybe some images. But at the end of the day, all these things are actually just textual data that we receive from the server. So that means that in order for us to be able to build our website, we need to create these three things: an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file. Actually, we don't even need a JavaScript file if we don't want any interactivity. We don't even need a CSS file if we don't want any styling. We can even just use an HTML file. So in the next video, we're going to build our first website. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. Let's build our first website. Now, I've already created a folder called Web Server because this is going to be our web server for now. And inside of this web server, we have an index.html file, which will be the extension for creating an HTML file. We have script.js, which is the extension for writing JavaScript, just like we have .py for writing Python. And then we have style.css for writing CSS styles. Now, in this section, I'm going to be using Sublime Text and my iTerm terminal, but you can use whatever developer tool that you want. I like using these ones just for the screen recordings. They help because, well, it's nice and clean. It doesn't give me too many hints so that I can also make errors and show you along as I make errors how I fix them. But again, you can use Visual Studio Code, whatever you prefer. Now, you see over here that all these files are empty. But remember, a web server simply gives these 3 files to a browser so that the browser can display the page. So let's start off with HTML. How do we write HTML? Well, Sublime Text actually lets me do something interesting here. If I type in HTML and then hit Tab, it autofills it for me. All right, I kind of cheated, but hey, I don't want to bore you to death. So this is a standard HTML file. Because I have the .html extension, if I have this type of syntax, I can write HTML. And it's not that difficult. We have opening tags and closing tags with the backslash here. So we have the head of the website with the title. So this is what appears on the tab. So let's say my website. Very creative. So that's the head, and then the body. This is what gets displayed on a website. So in here, I can say, I am a webmaster. Just like that. And we've created our HTML file. Now, check this out. If I now open index.html, if I right click here and let's say open in new window, or you can even just go and double click this file. So if I double click this, look at that. I am a webmaster. Just simple text, nothing too crazy, but I've just created my first website. Let's continue with CSS. CSS has a different syntax than HTML. CSS syntax goes something like this. We can give it what HTML element we want to add some styling to. In our case, let's say body. And I can say body, then curly brackets. And in here, I want to have background, let's say color. And we'll go with, let's go with green. If I save this and I refresh the page, nothing happened. And this is a little small detail that, again, this isn't a web development course, so we don't need to worry too much about. But essentially, the very first thing that happens is that the HTML file gets sent, and the HTML file is actually the only thing that gets read by the browser. So within the HTML file, I have to say, hey, HTML, by the way, we also have a CSS file. Can you also use that in the website? So we can do that in the head tag by using something called a link tag. So a link tag, we can actually remove some of this. We simply have to say, hey, it's a type of text, CSS, and it has something called href. Href simply says, hey, where is this file located? In our case, because it's in the same folder as our index.html, we can simply say it's style.css because, well, just look for style.css and that's where the style file is. And now, if you remember, we also had the relationship style sheet that we need to include. I just removed it so that we can see what we're writing over here. So if we do style sheet, and this is just something, a syntax that you have to get used to if you want to include a CSS file. If I save this and go back and refresh, hey, look at that. My ugly website, let's make it a little bit bigger. My ugly website with a green background color now has some style. If I open up the developer tools once again, and I hit refresh, look at that. I get an HTML file and a CSS file. Awesome. So I just created my own web server, right? We could even write JavaScript here, but again, this isn't a JavaScript course, so we don't need to worry about it. In this case, here you go. I just wrote some JavaScript, which this is kind of like writing print in Python. If I refresh the page one more time, again, JavaScript file doesn't get displayed because, well, we have to, again, tell index.html that we need a JavaScript file. And usually, JavaScript files are contained in a script tag, usually at the bottom of the body. So let's close that. And then in here, instead of using the href, we just have to say src for source. And then once again, where's the JavaScript file? It's at script.js. So if I save this and I refresh the page, look at that. We're now loading the script.js file. And all it's doing is if we click on the console tab is, there you go. It printed something in the console, and console is something that JavaScript uses. But all we care about is that we're able to serve these 3 files. What we've done is created our very first server. But you may have noticed something. When you went up over here, look at the URL path that we have. That's not what you usually type into a website, right? I mean, we saw that the website over here, xkcd.com, well, has the .com, uses HTTP. That's a real URL, right? Well, I'm sorry to tell you that we didn't actually create a real web server, because all we've done is we've served to the browser some files from, as you can see, from our computer. So all it's doing is the browser saying, hey, I'm going to display these files that are located right here on your computer. So essentially, we have a web server that's also running a browser, but that's not how real life works. Why would that be? Well, imagine if you had your own website. Do you really want to have people from all over the world access your website directly through your computer, grabbing the files from your computer? I mean, no, right? There's a lot of security issues. There's a lot of issues with performance. You have to keep your laptop on the entire time so people can access your website. Instead, we want a web server, which, as the name suggests, serves files and specializes in serving files to browsers somewhere in the world that I don't have to worry about. It's not on my computer. Somebody owns that machine. Somebody owns that computer. And it's on all the time so that whenever we go to a website or a link, it's always going to be running and sending those files out. So we're finally going to get back to Python here, because what we want to do is do something more sophisticated than just having these files on our machine. Instead, we want to build a real server using Python that we can deploy so that people can access our website anywhere in the world. Now, you might still be confused. This whole process might not make complete sense to you because we're just getting started, but don't worry. By the end of it all, it's all going to make sense. So let's forget about the browser for now and get into building a real server, something more sophisticated than what we've done up until now, which is just a folder with these 3 files, and we just double click on index.html. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Welcome back. It's time to use Python and build our real server. Now, what should we do here first? Your first intuition might say, I wonder if Python has a module already for that. Well, if you actually Google Python HTTP server, you see that, oh, look at that. Python seems to have an HTTP server. Awesome. And this module actually allows us to create a server. You can see over here that all we need to do is use the HTTP server, and, well, we have ourselves a server. You can actually read through the documentation and see how you can build one. You can see over here, for example, that it's a simple couple of lines to create a server. However, if I scroll all the way up, there is a warning here. HTTP server is not recommended for production. It only implements basic security checks. You see, building servers is a very, very common thing. A lot of Python developers are hired as backend engineers to build things like servers. So when we use something like the HTTP server that's built in as part of the Python standard library, well, we're redoing all these things that, frankly, a lot of developers have done before. And when you have a problem that is constantly getting solved, or the problem is constantly being rewritten and rewritten and rewritten, we start to have something called libraries, but also something called frameworks. That is, instead of using something that, well, frankly, would take us a really long time to do, and as you can see here, there's still a lot of issues like security issues that we need to check and fix, we can use a framework like Flask to build a server, because so many engineers are building servers using Python. Flask is a tool that uses, perhaps underneath the hood, something like HTTP server, but instead make sure that the security, the added tools and benefits are already pre-built for us. You can think of it as a kitchen. You're trying to bake a cake, and instead of you having to go buy the knife, go buy the bowl, the mixer, the oven, go buy the ingredients, all that stuff, Flask is like the kitchen where you get to enter the kitchen, you have all the tools necessary, you have the ingredients, and all you have to do is cook. Now, when it comes to Python, there's two really popular frameworks. There's the Flask framework and the Django framework, right over here. Now, Django is one of those frameworks that it's really, really big. It's a big, big kitchen. On the other hand, Flask is what we call a micro framework. That is, it's extremely lean. It's a small library so that we can do things fast. I'm going to teach Flask over the next couple of videos because I like the simplicity of it all. Sometimes when you write in Django, it feels like you're not even writing Python because there's so many rules and so many tools that you can use. Versus with Flask, everything is clean and small, and it's great for our use. So how do we get started? Well, as you know by now, as with any tool that we use, we should read the documentation, right? And in our case, we can just go to installation and actually read through and see what they recommend. You see over here that they recommend we use a virtual environment, something that we've already talked about in previous lesson. And you'll see why this is important when we actually deploy the project to production. But it looks like we first create an environment, so we make a directory, a project directory, which hopefully we already have. And then we create a virtual environment. Now, one thing I haven't told you is that if you use Python 3, which if you're following this course, you already are using, it comes pre-built with something called venv. So instead of pipenv or virtual env that I've talked about in the previous video on virtual environments, this comes pre-built. So we can actually just run this command in our terminal. So let's give it a go. And look at that. A new virtual environment folder was just created. Now, you see over here that the virtual environment was created, well, in a new folder called venv. If we actually leave out the first part, or the last venv, or actually, let's go back one directory and simply say Python 3-m venv, and then say web server. The web server now becomes the virtual environment because we already have the folder built. So we don't want a new folder called virtual environment. We can just delete that and instead have the virtual environment right over here. Now, it also gives you the option on how to do it on Windows. So again, on Windows, you might have to run py-3. Or if you're using Python 2 and you don't have the venv module, in that case, well, you have to use virtual environment. And then finally, we have to activate the environment. And all we need to do, if you're on a Mac or Linux, is just grab this code, or on Windows, grab this. So let's just copy and paste this. If I paste it in here, let's talk about what it's doing. Here, we have to change this to where our folder is. In our case, we're doing the web server, right? So I'm going to say web /space server, because, well, that's the folder that we want to go into from desktop. And inside of the bin folder, right here, we have the activate executable. So all we're saying is, hey, run this executable. We don't need to worry about what it does, but if I run this, we get a bit of an error. Now, the issue here is that I'm using something called a fish shell. And the reason I'm showing you this is because everybody's machine is different. So whether you're on Windows or Mac or Linux, or maybe you're using a different type of terminal, you might get these errors. Now, the best way to solve these is if you go to the VNV Python module, and if you scroll all the way down, you'll see here that you can activate using certain scripts, but depends on which shell you're using. Most of you are using PowerShell in Windows or Bash if you're using a Mac. In my case, I'm using this, fish. So all I need to do is actually add this .fish at the end of my script. You'll notice here that you might have to add different things based on what you're using. So if you're on Windows, you're most likely going to add .bat or .ps1. So let's try that again. I'm going to run the same thing, but this time say .fish. There you go. It's now working, and I am in the web server, which is this folder in the virtual environment. So now I can install packages here and just be in my own little world. Now, if for some reason activating doesn't work for you, you can actually still keep going with the lectures. It won't really affect you. This is just one of those things that it's a little tricky. You might not get it straight away, but the best thing to do is to always read the documentation and follow the instructions. All right, that took an unnecessarily long time. So let's finish off by installing Flask. If we go back to our guide, we can finally install Flask by doing pip install Flask. Now again, we want to make sure that our pip, if we do version, is for Python 3.7. But for some of you, you might have to use pip 3. So based on your needs, make sure you use the appropriate pip installer. Let's clear this. And just copy and paste and install Flask. Awesome. We've just installed Flask, so we can start using it in our project. But that was a whole lot of setup and a lot of downloading, so let's take a break, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Oh boy, wasn't that last lesson super fun with all that installation and setup and errors? Hopefully, things will be a lot better as we move along. That was, I'd say, the hardest part. We're back here at the Flask framework. And the next thing we want to do is we want to go to the Quick Start Guide. And I know I could just code along and show you exactly how it is, but I really want to show you the process of how you work as a developer, because once you're done with this course, you're going to be out in the world and you should know how to learn something new. Let's say at the next job, somebody says, hey, I want you to use Django instead of Flask. How do you learn it? Well, you read the documentation. So I just clicked on the Quick Start because I just want to build a server really quick. And you see here that the minimal application is, well, it looks like this. So let's just copy the code from here and we'll talk about it line by line, don't worry. So I'm going to close off these index files, the script files, and the CSS files. We're in our virtual environment. Let's clear this. And we can actually just create a new file. So in our web server, let's just say new file, and I'm going to say server.py. So we have a new Python file, and we're going to copy and paste that code. So we're installing or we already installed Flask, so I'm going to import Flask from Flask. And then we do this funny thing called app equals Flask, and we use the Flask class to instantiate an app. And we do this underscore underscore name. Now, when something is confusing, I always like knowing what's happening. So I'm just going to run underscore underscore name here and actually just print it out so we know what it is. And for now, let's just comment out the bottom part of this. Just click save. I want to find out what this name is. So let's see if we can run this file. I'm going to say Python 3 and simply say server.py. Oh, and we're in the desktop right now, so let's cd into web server. Let's clear and run that again. So Python 3 server.py, and there you go. So our name in this case is main. And why is that? Well, because this is the main file that we're running. This shouldn't really be a surprise, right? So we've created an instance of a Flask app, or set up our Flask app, and this is our app. And when we run it from our command line, it sets the name as the main. So that's the name of our app, essentially. All right, so we've created our app, our Flask app, and then we see that we're using, what is this? This is a decorator, right? We learned about this. Again, one of the cool things about frameworks is that they give you what we call a higher level of abstraction. That means we don't necessarily need to know what this is doing, what the code is doing underneath. We just know that this app.route decorator gives us some extra tools for us to build a server. In this case, it's going to say anytime we hit slash, or what we call the root, I want you to define a function called hello world and return hello world. But let's go back to the documentation. Now, one thing I want to note here is that when you call your Python file, make sure you don't call it flask.py, because this would actually conflict with Flask itself. So name it server.py or hello.py, whatever you want, just in case you get that error. Now, the next part is to actually run our application, our Flask application. Now, there's one other trick here that we need to do. We need to run the Flask run command. So Flask also gives us a command line run to actually run our server. But we also see here that we need to export. Let's make this a little bit bigger. We need to export Flask app equals to hello.py. And as you can see here, we just need to give it that environment variable. So Flask app, just like this. And if you're on Windows or PowerShell, it shows you what commands to run. Again, I'll link to this resource so that you can copy and paste as well. In my case, I'll just do export. So copy and paste here. And instead of hello.py, I'm going to name it server.py. And then we can do Flask run. Now, another option is to actually do Python-m Flask run. But since we created a virtual environment, we should be able to run Flask run. All right. We get a little warning. This is a development server. Do not use it in production deployment. All right, that's good. We don't need to worry about it because we're not doing production right now. This is just something on our computers. And you see here that it's running on HTTP 127.0.0.1. This is the standard. It's what we call a local host. This is the URL or the address of the laptop I'm working on. And for you, that's the same thing with port 5000. So if I copy this and open this up, what? Look at that. Are you kidding me? We just created our server with hello world. Where is this coming from? Well, it's coming from this, right? The slash says, hey, anytime we do the root directory, so this is like saying here, slash here. Anytime the browser requests for this endpoint, it's going to hit our server, and look at that. It's actually logging out that 127.0.01, which is us, we logged this entry, the app route is going to say, hey, somebody needs some of our resources, some files, some data. What should we do? Well, we have this hello world function that we're going to run, and we're going to run by returning hello world. That's right, we just created our very first server. Just to prove that I'm not making this up, let's put your own name on it, refresh, and I'm refreshing and it's not working. And that is because you see here that I'm actually making these requests, but the changes haven't been saved. We actually have to do Control or Command C, let's clear, and run the server again. So now, if I refresh, look at that. Now that's really cool. And I also want to show you that, see here how it says serving Flask app server.py? Remember when we ran the command, this, where we used Flask app equals server.py? This is what it's saying. We are able to do what we call an environmental variable and set Flask app, which is going to get displayed here, as server.py. So I could have called our app whatever we want. So if I go back here and just say super duper, and I run, you see that my Flask app is named super duper. Now, the other thing I don't like is the fact that every time I make a change, I have to restart the server. And you can see here that the debug mode is off. I can actually turn on the debug mode by doing something like this. Once again, we use the environment variable, and if we go to debug mode in our documentation here, you can see here that if we do flask env equals development, which again, instead of the Flask app, we'll say env equals development, and I run this again, you see that I'm now in the debug mode on. This is something that we use, again, just Flask specific, to make sure that it's in development mode. And what this does is, watch this, as I change this and save it, I go back and refresh. And I get an error. Again, this is one of the cool things with the debugger. So if I make this a little smaller, I get an error saying, hey, could not import super duper. Well, that's because I just changed the name from super duper, but it's actually trying to import this server.py, and well, we should probably name it server.py because it doesn't work. I only changed it just to show you what it does. So we can actually fix that. Again, the debug mode, as you can see, gives us a lot of information. So I'm going to close the server, fix my silly name from super duper to server.py. All right, we're all good. And then we're going to Flask run. All right, let's go back and refresh. And there you go. Everything is all good. But the cool part is that now, if I change this to just hello, save, notice how the server noticed the changes. You see over here, it detected changes and automatically changed things for me. So if I refresh, look at that. I don't have to restart the server and everything is working. Awesome. We have our basic server, but we still have a bit more to go because we want to get to the point where we can actually serve important information like HTML files, CSS files, and JavaScript files. Let's explore that a little bit more in the next video. Welcome back. So we have our, well, frankly, really boring website, but we've created our server. But what else can we do? A server usually accepts a request from the browser, right? Now, up until now, we've done what we call a root route. That is the home route, because in here, we haven't written anything. But sometimes in a website, you might see something like blog, right? And if I hit enter, you see that not found. The URL was not found on the server. Again, that's because right now our server is only waiting to hear for the root request. But if we type something like blog, well, there's no function here that cares about that, so it sees that there's nothing to care about and moves on. So let's create a blog route as well. I'm going to copy and paste and just say that, hey, we want to listen to the blog endpoint. This is going to be called, let's call it blog, and say, these are my thoughts on blogs. If I save, again, we have the debugger mode, so I don't need to restart. If I refresh now, look at that. These are my thoughts on blogs. And if I go to the root directory, I get hello. We now have multiple routes. How cool is that? By the way, if we open up the developer tools, go to developer tools, open up the network and just refresh here, you see that we're getting a document. Ignore this part. This is just the developer tools and the plugins that I have. But this is what we get back. We just get a simple document, a response, which is a text. And if I go to headers and I actually scroll down, you see that I requested this URL. I got a status of 200. And I see here that the content type that the server responded with was something called text HTML. Now, this is something that Flask does for us. You see over here that I just sent a string, but Flask automatically converts that to HTML so that the browser can understand it. As a matter of fact, if I go to Elements here, you see here that I have my HTML with a body of hello inside of it. So that's something that we get automatically, which is really, really nice. But now we can start doing some really neat things. For example, let's create another route. And this time, let's say I want the blog from, let's say, 2020 about dogs. Can I do that? Well, yeah, absolutely. Let's say blog 2. And this says, this is my dog. Very engaging blog post there. So now, if I go back, I do blog. All right, I get that. If I do blog 2020, let's say dogs, I get this is my dog. Awesome. So I can have multiple routes like this. What if I remove this and have 2 blogs with the same endpoint? If we go back and just go to blog, I get these are my thoughts on blogs. Because once it hits a route that it sees, which on line 9 it sees, it's going to automatically just return and forget about the rest. So let's bring our dog's blog post back. But you know what's a shame? Because we have this beautiful website, I'm being sarcastic here, this beautiful HTML website that we've created with CSS and JavaScript. Wouldn't it be nice if instead of me just sending out text, I can actually send those? Could I do that? Well, yeah, you can. You see, Flask has another thing called render_template. And this render template function is going to allow us to actually send the HTML file. So let's say the home route now, instead of hello, is going to do something different. Instead, it's going to run the render template function that comes with Flask. And in here, we give it the HTML file that we have. So we can give it a route, in our case, because it's in the same folder as the server file, we can just do index.html. If I run this, let's see if this works. If I go back to my home route, I get an error. Let's read the error. Template not found, index.html. So it tried to look for index.html and it didn't find it. That's not good, is it? What if we do a // which means current directory, grab the index.html. If I save and refresh, I still get the error. Again, this is another thing that you'd have to just learn as you read the documentation. But the reason that this is not working is because Flask automatically, when you say render template, tries to look in a folder called templates. So let's create that. I'm going to say new folder, call it templates, and put all my HTML files, in this case, the single HTML file that I have, I'm going to say move, and put it in the templates folder. So now it's in here, and let's save, go back, and refresh. And look at that. I am a webmaster. Everything is working. If I go to blog, again, these are my thoughts on blogs, but my HTML file that I've created is working perfectly. How awesome is that? And Flask uses this idea of templates to add multiple HTML files. So for example, I can create a new file. Let's just say duplicate here. So I'm going to duplicate this file and call it about.html. And this about.html is going to say about me. And let's go into server.py and have the root folder as index.html. And perhaps add another route, say about.html. And yes, I can do that as well. And in here, we'll grab the about.html. Let's call it whatever we want. Let's say about function. And if I go back, go to about, well, it's not going to work because remember I added the .html. There you go, about me. Awesome, this is great. We're starting to learn about different routes and how servers work. And we're able to send our HTML file. But what about the JavaScript files and the CSS files? How can we do that? In the next video, we'll find out. Welcome back. Let's figure out how to add CSS and JavaScript to, well, our index.html. Because if you remember, we are using script and CSS in here. Now, once again, with Flask, if we go to, let's say, CSS, we see that there's static files. Static files simply means it's a file that's never going to change. That is, CSS and JavaScript, usually once we send them out, they're not going to change. They're static. And you see over here that with Flask, we have to store the files on the file system as static/style.css. So we need to create a static folder. Again, this is something that you just have to get used to, but let's say in here, we'll create, just like we did with templates, we're going to create a static folder so that the Flask app knows to look in here for CSS and JavaScript files. So I'm going to move the JavaScript file to the static folder and do the same with the CSS file. So once again, move that to static. Now, if I just save this and run, you'll see that it won't actually work. Well, why is that? Can you figure it out? Again, because we haven't talked too much about HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Don't worry if you didn't get this. But if you remember, in our index.html file, we referenced these files inside of here. But the file paths have now changed. They're now in the static folder like this. So I have to say static script.js. If I now go back and refresh, hey, look at that. My beautiful green website for, let's say this is Christmas website, is now working. If I open up the developer tools, go to network and refresh, hey, check that out. I have my document, then I have my JS file, And why is there no CSS? Let me refresh again. Oh, there it is, right over there. We have style, CSS, we have JS, and we have the document. Awesome. If you're wondering why we're getting this little favicon error, favicon is the little icon that shows up on tabs over here. So we can actually even add our own favicon if we wanted to and send images. And the way we would do that is to, again, in our endpoint, instead of the blog, I'm going to say favicon.ico for icon. And we can just send it an image. How will we go about doing this? I'm going to show you the answer in the next video, but I want you to give it a try and figure out how you can send an image back to this endpoint so that we don't get this error, and when a browser automatically requests for this, which all browsers do, it's going to show up a little icon over here for us. So pick whatever icon you want and see if you can solve it. In the next video, I'll show you the answer. Welcome back. Were you able to figure it out? I just Googled around for some free .ico icons, and I really like this lightning bolt one, so I've just downloaded it as an ICO. And now it's in my folder over here as bolt.ico. Now, how were you able to solve this? If your first instinct was to Google for it, well, good job. That's what you want to do as a developer. You see over here that, well, Flask has documentation on how we can use it. Now, there's two ways to do it. We have this link way and a way that works with older browsers as well. Now, this syntax might not be obvious to you, but let's use this method and then I'm going to show you what it actually does. So let's just copy and paste. So we go into our index.html, and in our link tag, I'm going to add this. So let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see, and maybe a little smaller so that everything is in here. And we see here that we have this syntax that we haven't seen before that's actually going to be used with Flask that we're going to talk about. But we see here that it's going to be for the static folder, and the file name is going to be favicon.ico. But mine is called bolt.ico, so let's just call it bolt.ico. That's the file name. And it should be in the static folder, so I'm going to move this into this static folder, just like that. Now, if I just save here, I can actually comment this out, hit save, and see what happens. If I go back to my website and I refresh, hey, look at that. Do you see how I have a little bolt here? You see that the bolt.ico is now on my website. How cool is that? And I didn't really do anything crazy. I didn't even have to have an endpoint, which is really cool. Again, Flask, because a favicon is something so common, just makes it super easy for us so we don't have to clutter our code with a favicon endpoint. So I can just remove this. But you know what? I'm not a big fan of doing things without understanding them. And right now, what we just did here seems really strange. Where is this URL for thing coming from? What's with this double squiggly lines? In the next video, we're going to find out what all of this means. Welcome back. What is this weird syntax? In order for us to understand that, we have to understand this idea of a templating language. You see, the power of Flask is the fact that we can build things dynamically. What do I mean by this? Well, let's assume that in the body tag here, I write 2 curly brackets like this. If I do in here 4 plus 5, and I save, let's go back to our website with our cool lightning bolt, and let me close this for now. If I refresh, I get 9. Is that what you expected? How is that possible? Because if you're wondering, this isn't HTML. If I did this in a regular HTML, it will just show the actual curly brackets, 4 plus 5. But something is happening here. Flask looks at these double curly brackets and says, oh, this is an expression. This is a Python expression that I actually need to evaluate. And this is actually the exciting thing with Flask. Underneath the hood, it uses something called Jinja, a templating language. It's a way for us to do this, and Flask comes built in with that. So if we look at the favicon, what we just did is we've used Jinja to say, hey, I want you to evaluate this as Python. So if I copy this and I go to server.py, and in here, let's just do a print and paste this in. That is the exact same thing that we added to our HTML, except for we now need the URL for that comes with Flask. Let's move this here actually, inside of the route. If I refresh, I see over here that I get static bolt.ico. So it's printing the actual URL static/bolt.ico. Now, I could just technically have copy and pasted this and just done this whole thing as a string instead of using URL4. But if you go to the documentation of Flask, it talks about URL4 and why it's a good idea to build a URL instead of hard coding them. And it gives you actual reason of why you might do that. For now, you can just think of it as a safer way to build URLs. So that's all we're doing. We're essentially saying grab the bolt.ico from the static folder. And we're able to do this through this templating language. Very, very cool. And now we have an extra power in our tool belt. That is, we're now able to dynamically update parts of the page. What do I mean by this? Imagine if our super cool website, when I actually refresh here, gives me the username of that person. For example, if I request for the blog of Andre and I hit run, ideally it'll say, hi Andre, and then maybe show my blog post. Using Flask, we can do that. And let's find out how to do that in the next video. Welcome back. Flask has this other tool called variable rules that we haven't talked about. And what variable rules allows us to do is to do something like this, dynamic. So for example, /user/ with these greater than and less than signs and the username. Now, we'll get back to this in a second and some of this syntax. But if we go back, what we can do here in our server.py is perhaps, let's remove this because we don't need it anymore. Inside of our hello world, let's say that we want name in here. Or in our case, username. Now, the neat thing is that Flask is going to look at this and say, oh, this is something that we can pass on into this function. So I can now say username equals the username that we receive. So let's say username. And let's just change this to name just so you see what the differences are. So I'm passing whatever I receive here into the hello world name parameter. And now in my index.html, I can pass on this data by simply doing a second parameter and saying name equals to name. So now if I save this, go back to my index.html and put in name in here. And if I go back to our homepage, if we go to our homepage, and I made a little mistake here, this should be over here. So it's saying username from up here is going to equal a default if we want. So it's usually a good idea to have a default. I'll just do none for now. So that username now is going to be username in here, like this. If I save, go back, I get a not found because we don't have a homepage anymore. But anytime I do, let's say, Andre, I get, look at that, Andre on my page. I get Bob and my good friend, Sally. How cool is that? So it's able to read the URL and pass in data this way. And if we go to our Flask documentation and we go to variable rules, you see that we have different rules that we can apply. For example, we can actually require to accept a positive integer or a string or a float, a path, so it accepts slashes, or something called UUID, which is kind of like a unique identifier. So let's try that. Let's do a post ID here, or in our case, let's just copy this and say I also want the username, and then perhaps accept some sort of a number. So instead of post ID, maybe it could be, I don't know. Actually, post ID is good. Let's keep it like that. And let's make this a little bit bigger. Now in here, the second parameter can be the post ID. That's going to equal to none to begin with. And we're also going to pass this as post ID. That's going to equal the post ID. If I save this, go to index.html, and in here, let's do name, and then we'll also do the post ID in here. If I save, go back, and I refresh, well, again, because we've made our URL very specific, we'll just have to give some sort of a number. And look at that, I have Sally2, so that's her second blog post, then the fifth blog post, so on and so forth. And if I do something that's not a number, so if I do some string, I get not found because I've made the rule using this syntax, so int with the colon, saying that this has to be an ID. And I passed data down this way. So now we've created a full-out server. We now are able to use URLs to communicate with the server and ask for specific data for it to receive. Our server, based on what URL parameters we give it, or endpoints, is able to decide what resource to send to the front end so that it can display the appropriate information. But we can also do something interesting, like perhaps when we submit a form, to actually send perhaps the user's name with the form, so that when we send back a thank you note, we can say, thank you, Andre, or thank you, whatever the username is. Very, very cool. Now, these variable rules, as you can see, there's a few of them, and you can read through the documentation. You might also notice this syntax here, which is the %sign or %s or %d. This is actually another feature of Python that you can read about. But again, it's not critical to your understanding of Python. For now, though, I think we have the basic skills necessary to start building our portfolio website. Because up until now, frankly, this website doesn't look that great. So starting in the next video, we're going to build a really, really cool website. Something that looks, well, more like this. So that by the end of it, we can have a fully fledged portfolio website. And even though it seems like you haven't learned that much yet, you actually have learned all the skills necessary to build something like this. Well, kind of. Let's go explore some more in the next video. Hey, welcome back. I want to take a quick second to talk about this idea of data transfer from servers to the browsers. Now, we saw that when we open the developer tools, we can go to the network tab and actually see what type of data gets sent from the server. And here we saw that there's different types, but we mainly talked about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But we also see that there's a few other types in here. If I click on, let's say, the HTML, there's this field called content type that says it's a text HTML file. Now, this is something quite important because it uses something called a MIME type, and it stands for Multipurpose Internet Mail Extensions. Sounds very impressive, doesn't it? And you see here, and I'll link to this resource, and let's make this a little bit bigger, that browsers use this MIME type, not the file extension, to determine how to process a URL. So they look at the content type that our Flask app actually automatically sends to the browser to determine what to do with that file. So that they know, hey, is it an HTML file? Is it a CSS file? Is it a JavaScript file? Now, at the end of the day, all this data that we're transferring, it's all just text. But they can be in different forms, and the browsers can interact with them in different ways. For example, if we scroll all the way down here, we have different types, but we want to focus on the important MIME types for web developers. We have things such as plain text, we have CSS, we have HTML, we have JavaScript. So that if I go to the JavaScript file here, and I go to content type, I see that, yep, it's application JavaScript. And we see here that there's a little note about why it's application JavaScript here instead of text JavaScript. Either way, this way the browser knows I'm about to read a JavaScript file, do some certain things because it is a JavaScript file. Now, if we keep scrolling down, there's also image types. So again, if we look at the images, let's say the PNG, again, if we scroll down, we see that it's an image PNG. At the end of the day, it's actually text that we receive from the server, but in a way that it can be read as a PNG file. So based on this knowledge, websites work by sending all this data and letting the browser take care of, well, building the page for us. Now, so far we've only talked about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And usually that's how websites are displayed. But there's different ways that we can also use servers, such as what we call API endpoints. So right here, I have the swappy.co, which stands for the Star Wars API. And what it does, as you can see here, is it sends us data. So instead of displaying a web page, it just sends us information. So for example, if I copy this, like so, and then let's say we do people over here. So let's do people. If I hit enter, look at that. I get this data. And this content type is what we call JSON. And JSON is just this format of data that we can use in our applications. So again, a website might take this data and perhaps display the name Luke Skywalker on the front page. So this endpoint, instead of sending HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just sends us this JSON data. Because at the end of the day, all a server does is send some data, right? It serves data. We can send all sorts of things. For example, this RoboHash website, if I do, let's say, anything I want in here, and I hit enter, it sends me a random image of a robot. If I change anything in this endpoint, I get a different robot. So web developers and mobile developers use this idea of servers all around the world to try and grab information, grab data from a server and display something useful on a browser. And I hope this shows you the power that servers have. we can do anything. The options are limitless. And we can build all sorts of servers with Python to do all sorts of things for us. All right, let's get back to our portfolio website. Welcome back. So we've learned the basics of Flask. We understand what servers do, and we also know what browsers do. But let's be honest here, this is kind of boring. I mean, this is not impressive. If you show this to a possible employer, they're gonna look at you like a crazy person. So let's actually build a nice looking portfolio just based on what we've learned up until now. Now, I have a little gift for you. That is the fact that you won't have to write your own HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because, again, this isn't a web development course. And luckily for us, if you Google anywhere online for something like free templates or HTML free templates, you can find some really nice looking websites that you can just use for free. For example, let's look at Universe over here, and I'll link to this resource so you can take a look for yourself as well. If I preview it, check that out. You have a nice little website or portfolio page that you can just use. How cool is that? And it's actually already tablet and mobile friendly. So everything is already pre-built for you. That's pretty cool, right? So how can we use this? Well, let's just download it. And by the way, as you follow along, you can actually use whichever one of these you want. But for now, let's just use the Universe one just because there's a little astronaut here. It looks pretty cool. Let's just download this and see what happens. All right, I get a little question saying, how do we want to download the template? In our case, we want to pick HTML. And there you go. We get a nice little zip folder, and now we have this downloaded. So let's open this up. And oh boy, that's a whole lot of files and folders. So what should we grab from here? Well, there's a few things. First, this is the sample page. We actually don't need this, so let's just move it to trash. Next, we have assets. These are, well, different assets for our page to work, such as the astronaut page. So we'll keep that around. And then we have our HTML pages, which we definitely need. And then it looks like we have some JavaScript files and CSS files. Now there's a .gz here, which is what we call a compressed file, a gzipped compressed file. So this is just a way for the server to send a file or the JavaScript file, which you can see is 138 kilobytes, but in a compressed form, so 44 kilobytes. So this way we're sending less data to the front end. And then we also have something like map, which actually helps us during debugging. But in our case, we don't need to worry about this for now. So let's just remove all the gzipped and map files. So we'll move those to trash so that we only have one CSS file and one JavaScript file. And then all the other ones are HTML files for our different pages. Now what we're going to do is we're going to copy this and move it to our project folder. Remember this folder over here? So ideally we move the HTML files into the templates and the static files, that is the CSS and JavaScript files, and maybe the assets in here. So that is the images in here. So let's do that. I have my web server here. I'm going to first just copy and paste what we just copied. And let's move all our HTML files into our templates. And you know what? Let's remove our existing templates as well because we don't need them anymore. We have the pretty HTML file now. And then just have all of these. We have a new index.html that is going to be a lot prettier than our old website, so we want to use that. So let's move all that into templates. And then let's do the JS and CSS file, as well as the assets folder into the static. Awesome. So now that we have that set up, let's go back to our project and look at that. We have a lot more HTML that we haven't written, but luckily it's already created for us. Now, the last bit of setup is that because we moved our files around, we need to adjust the links between the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and all the asset files. So if we scroll, if we go to index.html, we see that we're looking for the favicon in assets favicon. But because this is in static folder, we have to add static in here. So let's find where else we're using the assets in here. All right, so it looks like, let's make this a little bit bigger. So it looks like here for our background image, we're once again looking for the space image, but that's, as we know, in the static folder. And let's see where else we have. Oh, we have over here as well. Let's do static. Let's keep going. Static. All right, everything is all good now. We have the static folder. Oh, and we have to make sure we add a slash in front of the dot. Dot just means current directory, and then look in the static folder. So let's go back. Make sure we do that for everything. There we go. And there we go. Now let's save this. And I don't think we're completely done yet, but for now, let's go into our server.py. And for our home route, let's remove what we've had before. And let's just call it my home function. That takes no parameters. And instead, it's just going to return for us our index.html with no passed in parameters. So let's save, go back to our page or my website, and see what we get when we refresh. All right, that's a pretty ugly website, but it looks like at least we're displaying something. But right away, we notice that, it looks like there's no CSS being applied. It looks like we have some HTML, but the links aren't working either. So once again, this is because we have to update the links between the files. So what we'll do is actually go back to index.html, and in the head tag, we see that we have our style sheet, our CSS file, but again, we have to update this to have it in the static folder, as well as the JavaScript file, which if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we have the JS file here, which once again will be in the static folder. All right, let's save and go back and see if that makes things better. Hey, look at that. That's pretty cool. Mind you, this looks a little big because I increased the size of my website by doing command plus and minus, just so we can see better. But that's pretty awesome. Now, if I click on, let's say, works, I get works.html does not exist. So how can we fix that? We already know how to do that, right? All we need to do is to update these different routes so that it points to the appropriate template. Now, in the next video, I'll show you how to do that, but I want you to attempt to do this yourself because we've learned this by now. So try to make the website work exactly like we had it over here on our mashup templates, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, were you able to get that? If not, don't worry. Let's go over what we need to do to get everything on our profile working. So we obviously have an about.html page, so that can just stay the same as it is now. We can call it about. And if we copy and paste here, do another one, let's say, what else do we have? We have work.html, so let's do work.html, which will be work.html. And let's just check that this works, I'm going to remove the old route just so we have the home, about, and work HTML. If I go back and let's go to home. Oh, looks like we have a bit of an error. And I did not change the function over here. You see that I have both about, so let's just call this work. If I go back and refresh, all right, let's go to works. Oh, it's works.html. Why isn't that working? That is because it should be works.html. Silly me. All right, let's go back. Let's refresh. Works. All right, works is working, but once again, the CSS is not being applied. If I go back and let's go to About Me is working as well, but the CSS isn't being applied. And we know why that is. Once again, if we go to works, we have to update this to include the static folder. Awesome. And then we update the CSS page as well as the JavaScript page. So this is a lot of repetition, but I'm just showing you so you understand what the thought process is and why we need to do this. Again, we'll just fix these as well. And this one. I feel like I should have a song in the background as I do this so you don't get bored of me just doing this over and over. But repetition is good, right? All right, last one, the JavaScript file. Let's save. Go back to our server. Let's refresh. All right, let's go to home. Uh-oh, looks like index.html is not working. So we got to fix that as well. We have the route directory that's working. If I click on works, looks like the CSS didn't work. Let's see About Me. About Me is working, so we missed something in works. If we go back to, and that's because we have a work and works HTML. So we have to make sure that we incorporate the works HTML instead of the work one. I'm not sure what this page does, but I'm sure it's part of this. So again, going into our works HTML, doing the same thing we've been doing, adding the static. Like so. And all the way at the bottom for the JavaScript file as well. Let's go back, go to works, and hooray, look at that. All our works are being displayed, but it looks like some of the images are not displaying. Now, can you guess why that is? Well, if we go back to our works HTML and we look for our images, we see that here we have to add the static as well. So again, I'll add those to the images, and just to make this faster, I'll just copy this and do Command F or Control F to search for all instances of images and make sure that we add the assets in here. An easy way of doing this, and this is what an IDE can help you with, or a text editor like Sublime Text, is I can select the entire thing like this and do Command Control G. And this actually selects all the instances. And I have now multiple cursors. Now what I can do now is just add the static on all the instances, as you can see at the bottom and the top here as well, so that I don't have to repeat myself. Now let's go back, refresh, and look at that. We have our projects displaying. That's really, really cool. And just like that, we have our templates. Now we still have the components that we need to fix and the contact. Now the components we actually don't need, because if you go to the preview here, the components is just an HTML template that you can just copy and paste based on what components you need. but we don't actually need that on our real portfolio. The only other one that we need is the contact page, which is really, really important because we're going to use that for our Python server. So let's go back here. Let's remove the components.html. Or for now, we can just keep it there, but in the index.html file, we can go all the way down. And in the navigation bar section, you see over here how we have the components.html. We can just remove that, just like that. So we're not using it. Now, one thing you may have seen me do is copy and paste code so that now we would have to do another route that says contact and then once again do contact. But this is us repeating code. Based on what we've learned, can we improve this so this becomes more dynamic so that maybe when we add a new HTML file to this profile, we don't have to constantly just copy and paste the same code over and over? Try that, and in the next video, I'll show you how we can do that. Welcome back. Let's make this a little bit more dynamic. We have our home route, but for all the other HTML pages, it'll be nice if this was generated dynamically so that we don't have to copy and paste code. So let's delete all of these and instead use this little syntax that we learned about, where we can dynamically accept different URL parameters. In this case, we can just call it page name. And this page name should be a string, right? So now we can use the string type to say, I want the page name. So this is going to be HTML page. And we want to render in the template the data that was entered in the URL. So we can actually give it the page name here as the input and print out the page name here. Let's see if this works. I'm going to save this, go back to our homepage, and it works. What if I do works? Yeah, look at that. If I go to About Me works. Contact. All right, contact is working, but the CSS isn't being applied, so we have to update that. And we still see the components. All right, so there's a few things that we need to fix, but everything is working dynamically, which is great. And you see that even index.html that we had issues with before is now working, which is great. So let's fix a few things. We've now made our code super simple and easy to understand. But there's a few bugs that we need to fix in our code. First is to remove the components. Now, the reason this is happening is that each page, if we scroll up to the top, so let's go to the About page, has the components link. So from each page, we just have to remove the components. So let's go to Contact, remove the components here. Go to Index, we've already removed the components for that one. If I go to Work, Work is a little bit different. We'll get back to that in a second. If we go to Works, and again, at the top in the navigation, the components we can just remove, just like that. We also saw that the contacts page doesn't have CSS added to it. So again, we go back and we add the static folder here. Same with the favicon. Right over here. And then the JavaScript file at the bottom. If we save, go back, let's refresh, and go to Home. If we go to Works, that works. About Me, that works. Contact, look at that. How pretty is that? All right. Now, a few things that I want to fix here. One is that we see that the numbers don't match over here. We want them to ideally match, right? So we have this working, but then About Me and Contact, that's kind of weird. Let's see why that is. If we go back, we go to contact. We see that in the navigation, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, which looks great. But then at the bottom, we see that the numbers contact me are a little bit off. So let's just do 04 for contact me. If we go to about, making sure that the about page or about me is 03. So let's do that. And now if I save and refresh, we have contact me, about me, works, and home. All right, 2 last things, and then we're going to get back to Python, I promise. One, I want to change this text so that it says my name, and maybe I'm a Python developer. So all we have to do is, once again, go to index.html and look for this text. Add your site or app content here. So we can see here it says, hello, I'm James Dean, French designer. So let's just say I'm Andre Nagoy. And let's say Python. Let's say expert. Sounds cooler. Working as a freelancer. Let's do an instructor, because I am an instructor after all. So that if I save and refresh, how awesome is that? Super, super simple. That looks pretty neat. All right, the last thing is the works part. If you look at my works and I click on discover, all right, so here you can add your own projects that you want. If I go to 06, I guess the links here aren't working since we only have one work. But let's say you wanted to add a different project. All we have to do is simply say work2.html and link in 002 here with work2. Let me show you how that's done. So let's go to work.html. If we do Control F and do 002, we see that these are the links. Look at that, 002, 003. So all we have to do is perhaps change the link here to work2.html so that it links to work2. Now, that's something that you can do on your own. Again, we don't want to focus too much on HTML and CSS because it's outside the scope of this course. But as you can see, we have a pretty neat website, pretty fast. It only took us a couple of minutes, and you now have a portfolio webpage. But there's one big piece missing, and one thing that Python can really help us with. That is this contact form. It wouldn't be a real portfolio website unless people can contact you, right? Maybe employers or people that need work done can actually send you a message. So over the next couple of videos, we're actually going to explore this, where we're able to send information to our server in the backend and actually capture it and save it and store it somewhere. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. All right, everybody, this is going to be really, really fun. We're going to create an actual contact page where users can submit contact information and enter a message so that they can contact you online. Now, if we go to the Quick Start Guide on Flask and we go to accessing request data, this actually shows you how to handle it. And right over here in the request object is the code for us to actually grab information from the browser. Now, there's even things like file uploads, so we can get people to load their files and actually send it to our server. But for now, let's just focus on this. I want to copy the code first, and then we're going to talk about what's happening. Let's go to our server.py. We have our basic routes right here, and let's add another one like this. Now, the only thing I care about right now is this part right here. I want to create a new route that I'll name for now submit form. And this is something that we'll actually have to create. It's going to have methods post and get. And again, this is just the default. Get means the browser wants us to send information. Post simply means that the browser wants us to save information. But we won't worry about that for now. We also want to define a function called submit form. And finally, I want to just return for now a form submitted hooray message. So that's our submit form endpoint. But it's not doing anything right now. We're never calling this on the front end, on the browser. So how can we get this to work? Well, let's go to the contact.html and figure out when we click the button, what happens. And actually, let's just search for it. If I go to title page, you see that we have the send button. So when we hit send, we ideally send some information to the server. So let's Command F and look for the send text. And look at that. It looks like it's over here. Let's make this a little bit bigger, just like that, so we see what's going on. We see that we have a button of type submit, and this is the button that we're clicking to send. So it's on line 74. Now, at the top here, we see that we have something called form. And with form, we have an action that we can take. This is standard HTML. When HTML was created, the idea was to display pages, but also using this form, be able to send data to the server. And we do that using this action attribute. And in here, we can put post or get. And if you remember, that's exactly what we have here. This endpoint will be able to accept methods, either get or post. Now, we don't need to get into the details of what get versus post is, but a good way of thinking about it is we can send data with get by simply attaching the information to the URL in here. But ideally, we don't want to send people's emails and message in the URL. Ideally, we want to send it into some body of text that's not so clear and obvious. So in our case, we're going to use post, and I'll show you how this works. So we're going to have an action in here that is post. Now, the way this actually works is we will have to call the submit form, which, by the way, is what our endpoint is going to be, so that with the form, when I click send over here, it's going to run this URL, essentially, submit form, with a method that is post. So the action submit form will be posted when I click send. Let's save this and double check that it works. So I'm going to say submit form here. I'm going to save. And for now, I'm just going to return form submitted, hooray. If we go back and just write some gibberish, let's actually refresh, make sure it's new. If I click send, look at that. I get form submitted, hooray. And you see that the endpoint here is submit form. This was the action that we added in the HTML file. Again, if we go back, open up the developer tools, go to network here. Let's make this a little smaller. If I click send, look at that. In my network, you see that we have the submit form. If I click on it, I get the response, which is form submitted, hooray. And if I go to headers, you see that I did a post method because that's what I said. This is going to be me sending data to the server. You see that the content type is application XWWW form URL encoded. This is just a standard data type that we can send when we use the form tag in HTML. But we don't need to worry about that because we now have access to the data that the user sends. So in the next video, we're going to try and capture the data that I sent to the server and actually read it with our Python code. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. So we were able to submit our form. And ideally, now we have a way to capture that data that the user sends to the server. Once again, if I submit some sort of data and click send, I get form submitted. Hooray. Now, if I open up the developer tools and refresh that, you'll see that we have a few errors that we have to take care of. One is this form submitted. So if I scroll all the way down, there's actually one thing I need to fix in order for my server to be able to read this data. We have to go into our contact.html, and we just have to make sure that all our inputs, that is email, text, and the text area, have a name attribute. And this is so we can actually grab the data on the backend. I'll show you what I mean. So let's have name here as email, name here as the subject, and then name here as the message. So that if I save this now, and I go back to my contacts and submit this again, well, we'll have to refresh it first. So let's refresh, send some messages. And if I click submit now, and we go to submit form, you'll see that if I scroll all the way down, I have a form data field. We now have email, subject, and message that we actually send all the way back to our Flask application. Because we now gave it these name attributes, it knows what to send. So this is just a quick gotcha. It's just an HTML form standard that we'll just have to add ourselves. Now, if we go to the Flask documentation, we can access these values using the request.form. So if we go back and we go to server.py, we can do something like they say in the documentation. I can say if request, and this request is something that we'll have to import, which I already have done from Flask. So if request.method, which is if we said that the method is going to be post, which if we looked at contact.html, we have the method as post. So if that's the case, then I want you to grab that data by doing request.form, and I can access different values like email or message like this. Now, an easy way for us to grab this information is actually to do a method called toDict, which is turning something, the form data, into a dictionary. So we're going to get everything as a dictionary. And then finally, to make sure that we get this data, let's just print data. And we just have to return something. So let's say return. And I want you to return form submitted for now. Otherwise, we'll just return something went wrong. Try again. If we save this, let's open up our terminal and let's go back to the form. Let's refresh. I'm going to close this for now and just submit our regular information. If I click send, form is submitted. I have some errors here that we're going to have to fix soon. But if I scroll a little bit up, look at that. We have email, subject, and message as a dictionary on our backend. We just transferred data to our Python app. How cool is that? Now, the reason we get this error at the bottom is because right now, when I submit a form, I'm still requesting the favicon icon. Now, if we go back to our application, you'll notice that anytime we visit a new area, our favicon is not showing. Well, if we go back to our page, let's go to index.html, we'll see that in the link over here, we're looking for our favicon.icon in static assets. But if you remember, we have our bolt.icon right in the static folder here. So all we have to do is just either rename some of those files, or in our case, we can just move this, call it favicon.icon, and move it into the static assets folder. Like so. Now, if I refresh the page, you'll see that I have my new Bolt favicon. Finally, I want to actually do something more interesting. Once a user submits a form, I want to have a little thank you message. Now, there's many ways of doing this, but the easiest way we're going to do is we're going to copy this entire file. So I'm just going to say duplicate and call it thankyou.html. Now, thankyou.html will be the exact same thing as the contact page that we created, except instead of the form that we have, so let's grab this form information. So instead of having this form, perhaps it will simply say, thank you. I will get in touch with you shortly. Just like that. Now, the cool thing that we can do here is that we can now redirect to the thank you page after they submit the contact form. And the way we can do that is in the server.py, we can import, let's make this a little bit smaller, and we'll import the redirect module. And all we have to do here, instead of saying form submitted, is we can say redirect to what route? Well, we'll redirect to thankyou.html. Like this. Again, because thankyou.html is in our templates, and because our routes are set up to change dynamically, we should be able to redirect to thankyou.html. If I save, and let's say refresh, submit some data in here, click send, look at that. Thank you. I will get in touch with you shortly. How cool is that? And there's many cool things that we can do here, right? Using the curly brackets like this, if let's say we ask somebody to submit their username or name, we can say thank you with perhaps their actual name that they submitted. So something like thank you Bob or thank you Ann. But that's something we've already talked about. For now, that looks pretty nice. So I'm able to now submit a contact form. Make sure that we don't get any errors. So if I click on send, look at that. HTML even tells me, hey, this has to be an email. Okay, let's send. And there we go. Everything is working. There are no errors. We're submitting the form with all our data, and we're receiving all that information right over here. How cool is that? So we now have our server.py set up to actually accept information. And now we have our website that's able to, well, hopefully allow us to have clients message you. But we need to do something with this data to store it somewhere. Because now this is in memory. Anytime I close the server, this information is lost. Ideally, we persist it somewhere, or ideally, we store it somewhere so that in the future, we can go back maybe a week later and see who has submitted a form on our website. Let's do that in the next video. Hey, you're still there. I know this is a bit of a long project, but stick with me. We're getting really, really close. You see, up until now, we've built this whole system, right? We have our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files that we got free templates for. And we also implemented our server so that the browser can actually send data to us and we can actually save that data and even send a thank you HTML page back once somebody submits a form. Our web page is now something more dynamic than just text that people can read. People can now interact with our web page by submitting a form. And we now have sent this form data to our Python server. But there was a problem that I mentioned in the last video. That is, as soon as the server stops running, or maybe it crashes, that data is lost because right now that information of the form is in memory. Ideally, we write it somewhere on disk so that even if we stop the server, that information is still somewhere on a file, so that this file lives on this computer, just like a file lives on your desktop or laptop. So how can we do this? Well, we've done this before, right? We simply write to a file. Now, we're going to explore this topic a little bit more throughout the next couple of videos, but what I want to do is to close off some of these folders and create a new file in here that will be a text file. And this file will just be called database.txt, just a simple text file. And this database will act as our database where we store information that the server receives. So if you remember, we're going to store email, we're going to store subject, and then we're going to store the message. So ideally, we're able to append or add to this file as people submit the form. So how can we do this? If you want, pause the video and give it a try yourself. Otherwise, let's try this. We can create a new function here, write to file. And this write to file will receive some sort of data that we'll send. And we're going to say with open, again, something that we've seen before. And we're going to open the database. And again, because it's in the same folder as the server, we don't need to specify a file path. We can say database.text. And we're going to open in the mode of A. So that is to append to that file because it already exists. And we'll just call it as database. And in here, we'll say that the file will equal database.write and then write what we want. In our case, we want to write the email, the message or the subject, and then the message. And we can just extract that from our data, right? That we're going to pass in. So we can say that email is going to equal the data email. Subject is going to equal data subject. And then message is going to equal data message because it's a dictionary, right? And then all we can do here is just do an F string and say that we want first of all a new line so that there's a new line every time there's an entry. And we'll say that we want the email, comma, the subject, and then finally, comma, the message. So that's our write to file function. And then in here, instead of printing data, we can just simply call write to file and pass in the data. So let's save this and see what happens. I'm going to come back to the page and then click send. All right, looks like things have worked, but let's see if we actually wrote to file. If I go to database, look at that. I have my data, that is the email, the subject, and the message. And if I go back to the page, let's say go to contact again, and this time let's do a different email, some text, some more text, hit send, and let's go back. And how cool is that? We now have our own custom database where we store all these users' information. And the cool part is that even if I close the server, I still have this information with me. I can always come back and see who has submitted a form. Very, very cool. And if by now you realize this is how databases work, well, good for you. This is how databases work. This is why you hear the words database. A database is essentially a place for you to store data in a safe way outside of the server, right? Because if your information is in memory, as soon as the computer closes, well, that memory is gone. Instead, a text file like this, even if I shut down my computer and turn it back on, is always going to be on disk, and it's what we call persisting. That is, it persists so that it never gets deleted. But how can we make this better? Well, right now this is just a text file. This is kind of inconvenient and hard to read. Maybe we're creating a startup landing page and we're collecting users' information, maybe email, so we can email people when the startup launches. A better way to create a database is maybe using a CSV file or an Excel file. So in the next video, let's explore that. Welcome back. It's time to learn about CSVs or CSV files. Those are Excel files that we're going to try and create our database in. Now, luckily for us, Python has a CSV module. And we're going to use this CSV module to do the things that we're going to do, which is to write, instead of our text file, to a CSV file. Now, if we keep scrolling down here, you can read all about the CSV module and how to use it. But instead of going through it line by line, let's just code it and show you exactly how it works. So I'm going to create a new file, and this time it's going to be called database.csv. And let's go back to our server.py. And instead of having the write to file function, let's write another function, which will be the write to CSV. And this one will be a little bit different because we have to use the CSV module. So I'm going to actually import it. If we go to the documentation, you can see that we can import it just like this. Import CSV. That comes built in with Python. Now, in here, we're going to do something similar, except we're going to open the file that is the CSV file. We're going to append to this file, and we're just going to call it database, or in our case, database2. So let's just say database2 here. Now, we have our data that we receive, but instead of a file now, we have a CSV or a CSV writer. So we're going to do a few different things here. First, we're going to write in our CSV these columns. Now, with a CSV file, by using these commas, so we have the email column, the subject column, and the message column, and the commas essentially say this is the end of this column, this is the end of this column, and this is the third column. So we can keep it the way that we have in the database.txt file. Now in here, let's remove what we have here. And we're going to say csv.write or writer to write to our CSV file. And this writer takes different parameters that we can give it. One is, where do we want to write this? Well, we want to write to the database 2. That is the file that we just opened. The second is a couple of options that we have. Now, if we go to the documentation and we scroll all the way up, you see that we have the writer, csv.writer, and then a couple of options. Now, this delimiter, quote character, and quoting are just options that we can give it that you can read on your own to tell it how we want to write into this CSV file. In our case, I want the delimiter to be the comma. That is, each item in a row will be separated by a comma. And whether we want any quotes around the characters, well, I don't want any, so this can just be an empty string. And then finally, quoting is going to be CSV dot, well, we can just copy exactly what's over here. Let's just copy quoting, CSV, quote, minimal. And again, just to practice this, let's say you wanted to know what quote minimal means. Again, we just look for that in the text, and it looks like instructs the writer object to only quote those fields which contain special characters. So essentially it's saying don't wrap data in quotes unless we really need to. Again, something that you don't have to worry about. This is more of configuration that you can just copy and paste. And you can read up on your own what each of these mean. The important part is the fact that we're writing to the database with some options. So now we have this CSV writer object that we can use. So this CSV writer can now be used like this. We can write a row, so write row, and this write row will contain the data that we want. And we have that, right? We want to write row exactly like we have above, like this. Except the way we write rows is that we give it just each parameter. So we want to give it the email variable, which we have here, the subject variable, and then the message variable. Just like that. Because we already have email, subject, and message, and the CSV writer is smart enough to say that these are going to be what we want, and we just pass it in instead of parameters actually as a list, like so. So that this row is going to contain email, subject, and message that we extract from the data. Now, if we didn't make any mistakes, this should work, but let's check this. Instead of write to file, let's do write to CSV. I'll save, go open up the terminal, go back to our page, and let's go to contact me again. Let's do w@w.com, some text, and hit send. Uh-oh. We have a bit of an error here. Quote character must be set if quoting enable. So it looks like I have just a bit of an error here. And that is because we actually need a quote character to not be empty in here. So if we're going to quote something, we just need to say, hey, what are we going to use? And in our case, we can use the quote sign with the double apostrophe. Again, we can use whatever we want. You might use this if you want, or this, whatever you prefer. So let's just do a quote that we use in a string. I'm going to save this, give it another go. Let's refresh. Actually, let's go back and submit again. All right, thank you. I'll get in touch with you shortly. And if we go back to our database, all right, we have our new data, but you see over here that we don't have a new line. Let's actually open this CSV file. If I go to database.csv and I double click here, all right, it looks like we're getting our data, but our database email and subject are a little bit off. Ideally, these are the labels and headers, and all the rows come after it. Now, let's go back and submit just a different user. Let's go A@W, add a couple of more, hit send. All right, we're adding new rows, but the only issue is that the first time we add a new row, we should have that extra spacing. Now, this is an easy fix. If we go to CSV and scroll a little bit down, we see that we have a write header method. So what we'll do instead is actually just add a new line option and just give it an empty string. So let's just clear everything. Let's just clear everything in here. We're going to save the database and just have server.py. We're going to go back and submit the forms a couple of times just to make sure that everything works. If I go back and go to my database.csv, all right, we have our data. If I open this now, there we go. We have our database right here with our headers and our entries, so that now I can have as many entries as possible and people can contact me, and I'll always have this database for me to check to see if anybody wants to work with me. Very, very cool. But there's one other issue here. That is, right now we're just using an Excel file on the same machine as the server. You see, there's a problem here because now my server and my database are in the same location. So yeah, when the server stops, my file is still saved. But what happens if maybe this computer breaks or something happens to it and I can't turn it on anymore? I've lost my files. Or maybe we have so much data that we want to store. Well, this is where actual databases come in. Databases specialize in storing information. Large-scale applications can use databases to store large amounts of data and then do really interesting things with them, kind of like an Excel sheet, but even more powerful. And on top of it, we can actually have a database on a completely different machine, maybe on multiple machines, so that we're guaranteed not to lose that data. Welcome back. Databases exist for us to store data that persists. That is, data that hopefully lasts for as long as we want it. So we can analyze the data, maybe we can grab it when we need it. And that's what databases do. And most of the time, when you're working with web development, you have the front end that focuses on the browser side of things. So that is the CSS, the JavaScript, the HTML. We have the back end, which is usually the server side, where we can use things like Python, Flask, Django to build a server. And then we also have this database side in the back end, where the server communicates with something like MongoDB, a type of database, to actually store this information. So instead of storing that information on an Excel file, like we have been, we can store it on an actual database, which gives us a lot more power. Now, again, this isn't a course about databases, so we don't need to fully go into the topic. If I go back to server.py, in the submit form, I want to wrap this in a try except block just so we can catch errors in a better way. So after the post, I'll do a try block and we'll just indent this. And we'll also do a except here. And in here, we'll just return if there's an error, something, or let's just say, did not save to database. So that as we're testing this out, we know if something wrong has happened. In our case, we're going to check for the post. If it's not a post method, then we have an else condition that's going to return something went wrong, try again. And then we are going to try this piece of code. Otherwise, we're going to return did not save to database. All companies store data. From a simple record book of a small business, maybe even on a journal or a piece of paper, to massive companies like Amazon that need computers to store petabytes of data. Now, in order to store this information, pretty much every company, and sometimes individuals too, need something called a database. We saw in the last section how hard it was to have our server remember a new user. Every time the server crashed, the variable would get reset and then it would start all over. Or if we wanted to do a login or a sign-in check and iterate through the emails and passwords, doing a loop through JavaScript, that's inefficient. That's where database come to the rescue. So let's ask ourselves, what is a database? A database is a collection of data. And what we mean by data, there are many forms of them, right? There can be numbers, there can be dates, there could be password hashes, there could be user information. Databases allow us to organize this data in a way that is useful to us, and it makes data management easy. And something came out of that, and it's called Database Management System, or DBMS for short. It's a collection of programs which allows us to access databases and work with data. And it also allows control access to database users. So a DBMS is something in this box. Something that allows us a tool, a piece of software that allows us to communicate with the database, store information that's useful for us, and also allows us to update, insert, delete, look up, whatever is in the database. And this idea of a DBMS really started to take shape in 1960s. And now it is at the forefront of many exciting things. There's an entire industry of engineers that just work with databases because it is so important. Now, there are two types of DBMS that are really popular right now and that we're going to talk about in this course. And these two types are represented really well by Postgres and MongoDB. Let's talk about the first one, which is relational database. And this is probably the most popular. As you can see on the right-hand side, you see that all of these are relational databases. Postgres, Oracle, SQL Server, you may have heard of MySQL, SQLite. These are all types of databases that have this relational database tag to them. And the beauty with them is that they're all pretty much similar. They all follow a same standard format. Relational databases consist of two or more tables with columns and rows. So in this case, users is a table, and full name, username, text created at are columns, and whatever values they have here are rows. Each row represents an entry, and each column sorts a very specific type of information, like name, address, or phone numbers. And then the relation between tables and fields is called a schema. In a relational database, the schema must be clearly defined before any information can be added. And if this is confusing right now, don't worry, we're actually going to create these databases so it makes sense to you. If we had Twitter, for example, you can see over here the types of tables that we would have and how we would organize it. We would have a users table, a tweets table, a following table. And we can connect all these information, for example, by connecting different pieces of the table. For example, the username will be the same in the users table as it is in the tweets table. That way, we can say that the username in the tweets table is the foreign key of the username in the users table. And then from user will be the foreign key of username in the following table. Now, things like full name or ID, something that identifies each row in a table, is called a primary key. And we'll go through that later on in this section. All right, so all these databases, we're going to learn about PostgreSQL, but they're all pretty much the same. So once you know one, it's fairly easy to pick up the other ones. How do they actually communicate with a server, with the backend? Well, all relational databases use something called SQL. And SQL allows us to communicate, just like HTTP did, between the front end and the back end. With SQL, we're able to communicate with the database and modify or get or update however we want. And we'll have a video on this topic as well. All right, so that's relational databases. What about the second type? The second type is called a non-relational database or a NoSQL database. And once again, there are many, many different types of databases with some cool names like CouchDB and Hypertable. Now, a MongoDB or a non-relational database lets you build an application without having to define the schema first, unlike a relational database. If we go back to relational database, this schema or these tables have to kind of be predefined, right? We need to know how our app is going to look, make these tables so that once the app is public, we can start entering user information and tweets and followers. With a NoSQL or non-relational database, we can just define it as we go. And they all have different ways of storing this information. So each one is very, very different. And this is another powerful reason to use a non-relational database, is that if your data requirements aren't clear at the outset of your project, and maybe you have a massive amount of unstructured data, you may not have the luxury of developing a relational database with a clearly defined schema. They offer instead a greater flexibility in that a non-relational database are more like folders, just assembling related information of all types. Now, MongoDB is something called document-oriented. It stores information as documents. Let me illustrate this point to you. I have my desktop here with two folders. One is a relational database, and here I have users, tweets, profile, following. And you can think of relational databases with this type of storage, where this folder lives somewhere on a computer that stores this information. And anytime we need to ask a database for something, well, we grab the users. And if we also want to grab the tweets of the user, we find the user that we're interested in, then find the tweets of the user that we're also interested in with the foreign key that links to the users. And we can also find however many followers that user has. We grab that information and display it on our web app. MongoDB, on the other hand, will actually have each user as a document. So if I wanted to grab the first user, well, I just grab this document and it has all the followers, the tweets, the profile, everything is in this one document. And you might be thinking, MongoDB looks like a better choice than having this way of doing things, right? Well, it depends on your need. And that's why databases is such a complex topic. It really, really depends on your situation. You can see this MongoDB way being very useful if you had something like a profile, maybe a LinkedIn profile. But if you needed something where you're working with just following data or just tweets data, maybe with the tweets, you want to see what is the average tweet size. Well, it's really easy to just grab this file and calculate that versus this way where you might have to extract it from each one of the users. So it really depends on your needs. Let me show you another diagram that might be useful. When we look at relational versus non-relational databases, you can think of relational as each table has a blog post, a blog tag, a blog comment, and it links these tables to give you the blog information. Versus a non-relational that stores this entire blog post in an entry and has comments, tags, categories, and all other related data just in one single place. So what does MongoDB use to communicate? If we go back to our example here, we had SQL for relational databases such as Postgres. Well, MongoDB has its own what we call query language. And it is just the MongoDB query language. But they both aim to do the same thing. That is to communicate with the database, provide an easy way for the server to communicate with the database. And in this section, we're going to be talking about that. And we're going to finally connect the dots and show you the power of databases once they're connected to a server. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. We have our Flask application that saves user contact information to a CSV file. And this is all great. It's working really, really nicely, right? We have a beautiful website. We even have contact forms. But there's a problem here. You see, we're running the browser as well as the server on the same computer. But this isn't real life, because if I give this URL to a friend, they're not going to be able to see it because this address points to localhost. It's saying localhost like this. It's the same thing, but localhost simply means your computer. So it's not like anybody else but us can access our app. That's not very fun, is it? Ideally, we can create this app so we can send it to all our friends, our family members, and possibly future employers. So how can we do this? In this video, I'm going to show you a really fun, easy way to deploy your application or your website online. We're going to use something called Python Anywhere. And Python Anywhere is going to allow us to host our files, that is, all the files that we have here, onto a server that they give us for free. So this is completely free. All you have to do is simply log in, and you can click on sign up. You can see that they have a different pricing plans. So you can actually pay for their service, but for a beginner plan where you can create one web application, we can do that for free. So let's create a beginner account and create your username and password. Agree to the terms. Sure, I've read everything. Oh, somebody else took my username. How dare they? Let's go with Andre N. So again, create your own account. And there we go. We have our dashboard. Now, the way Python Anywhere works is that we need to load up the files on a machine. Kind of like how we have our files over here on our computer, we need to somehow upload them to Python Anywhere's computers. Now, the way we can do that is using GitHub. So I'm going to open up my GitHub account. I'm going to click on New Repositories. And I'm going to create my project here. So let's just call it Portfo, because it sounds kind of cool and all the trendy names are short like this. So this is my portfolio project. I'm going to keep it public and then initialize with a README and then create repository. Now, from here, I'm going to clone this repository. If you have SSH set up, you can copy the SSH, otherwise use HTTPS, which might ask you for your GitHub password when you clone. So all I have to do now is to open up a new terminal. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And say git clone, and then copy and paste the URL so that it clones our project. Now from here, if I open this, we have our web server and then our portfolio, which is our GitHub account. So we can just copy the files here. Now, the ones that we actually need is we need the database, CSV, because these are going to be the files that we want to upload to Python Anywhere. So for now, let's just select the CSV file, the server.py, the static folder, the templates folder, because those are all the files that run our Flask app. Now, if I copy and paste this in here, you might be asking yourself, what about the other files? Well, there's a neat trick here, because these files over here were created because of our virtual environment, right? We have things like Flask installed. We have libraries like Python 3.7. We have our PyCache folder. Essentially, these folders created the virtual environment for us. However, there's an interesting trick here that we can do. We can run a command called pip freeze. And remember, you might have to do pip 3 based on what type of installation you have of Python on your machine. But if you do pip freeze with this little arrow and then requirements.txt, notice what happens as that requirements.txt gets added to my project. Watch this. Do you see that? I get a requirements.txt. And this requirements.txt, if we click on it, we see here that we have the requirements for our app to work. And the cool thing about this is that the Flask and then the Jinja for our templating, which we actually include in our libraries here, can now be used with the requirements.txt to not necessarily upload them to GitHub, but instead use this file as a way for us to install on any future machines any of these dependencies. I'll show you what I mean. For example, what we could do is upload all of these files to Python Anywhere, right? But that's a lot of files and a lot of work. Instead, we only upload the critical files that we wrote plus the requirements.txt, and automatically Python Anywhere is going to be able to install Flask and the Jinja and all the other requirements by looking at the requirements.txt. So for now, let's go back to our desktop and copy the requirements.txt as well into our portfolio page. So we now have all the files that we need for GitHub. If we go back, we can simply go into our portfolio folder and then simply say git add everything, then git commit and give it some sort of a message, my portfolio website. There we go. And then finally, git push origin master. And just like that, if I go back to GitHub and I refresh, look at that. I have all my files for my portfolio project. So using GitHub, we can now upload really easily to our Python Anywhere dashboard. The way we're going to do this is to actually now clone this repo with all these files, and we'll use HTTPS. Let's copy this and then go to our dashboard. Now in here, in the console, we can hit bash. So this will open up the terminal where our computer that is hosted by Python Anywhere exists. Let's make this a little bit bigger. In here, I can say git clone and clone this repo. There we go. And now, if we do ls, and remember this is a Linux machine, so Linux commands like ls is going to work. So we see that we have the readme text and the portfo. So let's go into portfo. And we see here that we have, look at that, all our files on our machine. Now, the cool thing is that if I go back to the dashboard and I go into my files, you see here that in the directories, I have a portfo project, which is my files that we've created. How cool is that? So I now have all the files necessary for me to run the app. But how can we run an app? Well, we have a web app tab. So remember, with the free tier, we get access to one free web app. So let's open up the web tab and add a new web app. So unfortunately, with the free tier, you can't have custom domain names. That is a way for you to say andrenagoe.com or whatever websites you want. Instead, they're going to generate one for you. But that's something that you can look into on your own if you want to pay for it. But for now, let's just use the free tier. So we can select the Python framework that we want to use. And I'm actually going to do manual configuration. We can pick whatever Python version we want. Let's do 3.6 for now because that's what we've been using. And then finally click Next. There we go. We have our Python project at this URL address. But if I click on this, all right, I get a hello world. It's working, but this isn't our portfolio. So how can we make that work? There's a few things that we need to set up. First, I'm going to link you to this tutorial on showing you how to set it up in case you have any problems. But let's go step by step. First, what we need to do is scroll down and enter the source code. So that is, where is the code that we're looking for? If you remember, let's go over here to Files. We have our portfo folder. So what we want to do in the web is to say that we want portfo in here. And it's going to automatically create that link for us. So that's where our source code, our server code exists. Now, if we go back here, we've gotten our code onto Python Anywhere. And then we have to set up our virtual environment. So we have to open up our console. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And then just run these commands. So in our case, because we're using Python 3.6, we're just going to copy this, go to our dashboard, into the bash once again. So that is the computer that we're going to serve our files from. And then copy and paste to create a virtual environment called my_virtual_env. And while that's installing, our next task is to install Flask. So once again, we'll copy this. So let's run pip install Flask. And you'll notice here as Flask is being installed that we're now in a virtual environment. See here how it says my_virtual_env, which was what we told it to name our virtual environment. And then the next step is to run this command. Well, actually this command won't do anything because this command, work on, simply takes us to our virtual environment, which we already have created. This is for next time whenever you, let's say, go back and open up the console to make sure that you're always working in our virtual environment. Now in here, if I look at the files, I have my portfo project, but I can also run using the requirements.txt that we have. In case we have a lot of dependencies, we can actually run this command so that it reads our requirements.txt to install any dependencies. Oh, couldn't open up the file because we have to cd into our portfo first. and then run this command. In our case, we don't have that many requirements and everything is set since we installed Flask. But this is how we can use the requirements.txt to install all our dependencies. Awesome. So going back to the tutorial, we see that we've set up our virtual environment and we need to go to our web tab to set up our virtual environment so that it knows where the web tab to look for this environment. So going back, we can now go to our web. And I know this is confusing. This is what happens when you do configuration on a website. It's one of those things that you just have to learn or follow documentation. In here, in the virtual env, we will simply, as they ask, add the name of our virtual environment, which is my virtual env. So again, we'll copy this and automatically it gives us the link. Now finally, if we reload our application, it'll take a few seconds, but when it's done and I click, I get the hello world. Something is still not right because we want our server to be running, right? So it serves us the index.html. This video is getting long, so let's take a break and see you in the next video. Now the last step in order for us to deploy our portfolio website is to go to the configuration file right here. When we click on this, you'll get a whole bunch of text. And we can actually delete a ton of these things. You'll see over here that you can have things set up based on what framework you use, like Flask. So because we're using Flask, let's remove all of this code. Just have the Flask section. And we'll remove the comments. So we have import sys. And it has some description here that you can read on your own. But the key thing that we want is to remove the comments from here. Just like that. And then we want to make sure that the directory, so Andre, has a path to Portfo. So remember, our directory was home, username, and then the name of our project. Next, we want to make sure that we give the name as the name of our file. So in my case, it was server.py. If you remember, I have server.py right over here, and we're exporting it as app. So the app is the variable and server is the file name. So if you have a different file name, let's say you have run.py, then you would put run here. So let's do server. Let's see it save. And let's go back to the web. If I reload and run this, we get an error. Now, an interesting feature of Python Anywhere is that we can actually look at the logs. So over here, the log files, we can see what errors or what the server is logging. So in our case, let's look at the errors. Module not found error. No module named server. All right, that's interesting. Let's see why that might be. So if we go back to our configuration file, the reason that we got the error was, well, because I misspelled the path. So it couldn't find the server. So Portfo. If I save this, go back to web, reload, and click on our website, holy moly, we have our portfolio project live. That link over there, I can share with anybody and they could see it on their computer. If they're halfway across the world, let's say in India, yep, they can see my portfolio. But you want to know what the coolest part is? Well, the fact that all of our pages work, but also our contact form. So if I do something like, let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see, r2.com, some subject line, and then, oh, somebody's super excited. If I hit send, that worked. And the cool part is that next time, let's say somebody contacted you, all you have to do is actually go back to Python Anywhere. So let's go to a new page of Python Anywhere. Go into the files, and then check out the database.csv, and look at that. You have a new entry into your CSV file. And I can even save the file, I can download the file, so that later on, a week from now, I can check up on the progress and see how my portfolio is doing. And now I hope you're starting to see the power that comes with this. We've created an entire web platform ourselves. We've created the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. Well, we used some templates, but we still modified them to our liking, and you can continue to update them and change them to your liking. But we also created a server ourselves that also contains a CSV file that will be saved on this machine. And we moved that machine from just our computers to someplace like Python Anywhere that has a dedicated server or a server space for us, so that it's always running. And this is how things like databases and places like AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, and any other database or server platform works. They allow you to use their machine. They make sure that they're going to run fast, that they're always going to be on. And databases allow you to save things. So instead of saving items in a CSV, we can save it into a dedicated database so we can do more operations or we can store more information. But I hope that opens up the world of web development to you and how everything is connected. In just a few hours, we're able to create a pretty neat looking portfolio, right? I mean, yeah, there was some configuration, some issues, but now that you know how to do it, I bet you see a whole lot of possibilities of what you can do. You can now customize the site whichever way you want. Maybe learn a little bit more HTML or CSS to make the website a little bit more to your liking. Maybe you want to add some JavaScript to make it even more interactive. Or maybe you want to explore different things, like perhaps hosting this application in someplace other than Python Anywhere, or maybe creating your own database. The possibilities are endless. So I hope this was exciting to you. This is one of my favorite topics, and it was a lot of things that we covered in a short amount of time. You're not going to be an expert web developer just from a few videos, but I hope this at least shows you the world of web development and how you might want to be involved in this world. Good job getting this far. This was a really tough section. If your brain hurts, don't worry, go take a nap, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.